Clonmel Junction Arts Festival.
Good afternoon. You're joining us this afternoon at the Clonmel Junction Arts Festival. I'm delighted to introduce our panel. The session today is called Eyes on the Town, and it's a discussion about the future of towns. The starting point being that towns are our human habitat. They shape how we live, the physical, cultural and psychological side of people. And it also is how we promote the survival and health of the planet, is how we live together. And Irish towns and towns generally are a very important part of that. So to introduce you to our panel today, firstly we have Noel Buckley. Noel is the TY coordinator in the Presentation Secondary School in Clonmel. He's a religion and history teacher, and his students were involved in researching the space within the old walls of Clonmel as part of a project during this year, and that's going to be part of the festival. Secondly, we have Dr. Miriam Fitzpatrick. Miriam is an urban designer and an academic. She's currently on the board of the Heritage Council, and she also teaches in both UCD in Dublin and in WIT in Waterford in areas of architecture and urban design. Professor Loughlin Kealy is Emeritus Professor of Architecture in UCD. He's also an advisor to ICOMOS, the International Council of Monuments and Sites. He's a coordinator for the Conservation Network and the European Association of Architectural Education, and he's chair of the board of South Tipperary Arts Centre, and it is Loughlin who was behind this initiative today and this discussion and who has put the panel together. Orla Murphy is an architect. She's living in Westport in Mayo, and she's also an assistant professor at the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy in UCD. Orla is also a co-director of the UCD Centre for Irish Towns, and in 2018, along with her colleagues, Orla was a curator of the Irish Pavilion at the Biennale Festival in Venice, which was around the subject of Irish towns. It was called Free Market, and that exhibition has been touring the country over the last couple of years. Very successful initiative. Sharon O'Brien is from the Department of Architecture in WIT in Waterford, and she's also involved in local projects in Waterford and Clonmel in a collaboration between education and the community. So Sharon will be bringing her experience of that to it. From Italy, we're joined by Annuntiata Maria Oteri. She's also an architect, and she's a professor of architectural conservation in the Politecnico of Milan. Her research and education activity is around small towns and issues of depopulation, which is also an issue in Ireland as well as in Italy, and in the risks for our architectural heritage and our urban fabric in that depopulation and the sort of threat to the heritage that we have. So that's a round table of the panel. I'd firstly like to call on Professor Loughlin Kealy to maybe introduce us to why he put this panel together and what he hopes we'll be able to talk about today.
Thank you, Orla. The idea behind Eyes of the Town was really that we would take a fresh look at both the reality and the potential of towns. And in doing that, we were using Clonmel as a vehicle. I remember when I was a youngster at one stage, suddenly realizing that you could see as much and as little, looking at a patch on the ground as you could looking at the stars in the heavens. That all the time, what you were to see anything, you're looking for patterns and connections. And so in that sort of sense, we're looking at Clonmel, using Clonmel as almost like a guinea pig in order to examine ideas that have much wider application, looking at the challenges that face towns really across Europe. Now, to do that, we put together a project last year connecting the transition year students in Presentation School in Clonmel with students in the WIT School of Architecture. And the idea was that they would work in parallel and in collaboration. They had, I suppose, distinct projects, which will be talked about probably later on, but also there were occasions when they came together and shared their experiences. So the Eyes of the Town idea was originally applied to a seminar that we had in the museum here in Clonmel, which marked, if you like, a staging post in the middle of that project. There was to have been a third stage, another stage involving LIT as well, which fell victim to the COVID pandemic. But essentially, the idea behind it all was, as you said, an ecological perspective. And the notion that the town is a human habitat and how it can support human life and the potential for humans to grow and develop to the greatest possible degree. And to realize that we're doing this also in a wider context. It's to do with the local and the global, the short and the long term. It's really an ecology project to do with human survival in the larger term.
We have a panel today, so we're going to maybe work around 3 different themes, and I'm going to call on the panelists maybe to give us some thoughts and response to some of those themes. The first one of those is very real for everybody, whether you're an academic or whether you're living in a town or whether you're interested in towns, and that's the idea of the experience of the town today, what it's like to be living in a town. And maybe in the recent months, we have more of a refocus on some things that are very important, like the importance of community, the importance of having local services. Maybe we're going to rethink some of that now with opportunities for remote working, and a real sense of people thinking about their quality of life, commuting patterns maybe that aren't sustainable, about connectivity, and some of it is digital as we are today, and some of it is the human connectivity of just being on the street in a town and the people you meet every day, and those interactions that it's a very important part of the life of a town. And of course, some of that will then tie in with climate change and how we use our communities, how we move around, and how we make best resource of the resources that we have. So first off, I'd like to call on Orla Murphy, maybe if you'd like to comment on that.
Thanks, Orla. It's lovely to be part of such a nice discussion today about towns. I suppose, firstly, it might be just important to note that Ireland really is a country of towns. While we've got 6 major cities, we have over 200, we're 230 towns, and they'd be considered as urban settlements of more than 1,500 people. So that definition varies internationally, but in Ireland, we consider towns to be urban settlements of that scale and upwards. And essentially our towns, although having different origins, have been traditionally connected with the idea of exchange. So whether they were Anglo-Norman towns or Gaelic towns or plantation towns or more recent planned towns, that idea of exchange has been central to the function of towns historically, and has led to the urban morphology of towns being made up of a hierarchy of streets, and then connected. Those streets are connected by public spaces, usually for the purpose of trade and gathering. And we see that reflected in our towns today and in the place names of towns. You have Market Street, High Street, the Corn Market, Fair Green, Potato Market, Shambles. They're all, I suppose, connections back to that idea of fundamentally produce being produced in the hinterland of towns and brought into towns to be sold and exchanged. So towns have continued to evolve and to react to challenges that they faced over hundreds of years. And of course, for example, in the 19th century, the famine would have had a major impact on the emptying out and depopulation of towns. And we would have seen institutions established such as workhouses, hospitals, asylums, jails, etc., in slightly larger towns. But really, one of the biggest impacts, maybe in more recent times, has been the impact of the car on towns. And the car has facilitated, I suppose, 2 things. One is that the car has facilitated movement, so moving out to live outside of towns, which meant that fewer people are living within the towns. And the impact of cars coming into towns has changed our public spaces. So from being market spaces being places which are fundamentally about pedestrians and goods being exchanged, the car has had a bigger dominance on those spaces. And that has impacted possibly on the quality of life and somewhat reduced the numbers of people living in towns. I suppose 2 points about that. Firstly, is that there is a deep resilience within towns to adapt to change, and I think they are going to have to adapt to change in the next decades, particularly in regard to climate change. And we've seen in the last 10 weeks post-COVID, or living with COVID rather, how we've seen our streets empty as businesses have closed down on streets. And here in Westport, literally there would be nobody on the street on an average day. And now businesses are opening up again, and we're seeing two things. Either here in Westport, we're seeing a lot more car traffic, and with tourists coming in, the town's really busy again. But in other towns, they've used that opportunity more to pedestrianize streets and to think about how we enjoy the streetscape of our towns more. So it's a really interesting time for towns, and it's going to be interesting to see how they continue to adapt.
Thanks, Orla. So from Westport to Sicily, Annuntiata, I'm sure you can understand a lot of what Orla has been talking about there in the recent months and the impact of COVID. Would you like to speak about the Italian experience?
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for your invitation. In Italy, the pandemic generated a sense of fear in people who live in big towns, mainly people who live in big towns. The images of deserted Florence or Milan or Rome went around all over the world, and they were at the same time beautiful but also terrifying. And probably for the first time after the Second World War, townspeople discovered the dimension of fear and unsafety in big towns. Paradoxically, the only ecological perspective of towns has been when possible to escape towns. A sort of opposite migration happened. I mean that those who could go back to their hometowns, including myself, literally escaped from Milan or Florence or Rome to go back to their original small towns or villages along the coast, but preferable in the small communities of the Apennine or the Alps. And these places are typically deserted as they are mainly depopulated. And as I said, we have seen many images or videos of a deserted Milan, but nobody showed the images of small deserted village during the lockdown, because it's the normality. And during the pandemic, the Italian anthropologist Roberto Caboi described life in Armungia, which is a very small town in Sardinia where he normally lives. And he wrote, before the lockdown, here in Armungia, we could do the shopping in the small shops of the village. We could take care of our gardens, walk in the countryside, go to Gigi the tobacconist and take coffee in Christo's bar. Now, apart from going to the bar, we can do the same things as before. In the small towns, in the populated areas, one did not live this dimension of sudden segregation, which people from cities live in such a dramatic way. And paradoxically, for those who live in such remote places, the impact of the disease during lockdown was quite irrelevant. Probably in small towns, one felt the fear due to the inaccessibility of health services and the disadvantage of the digital divide. But in some cases, the emergency showed the resilience of these communities who organized an impressive and alternative network of domestic healthcare system. For example, the so-called barefoot doctors who rediscovered a sort of territorial dimension of the therapy to unburden the hospitals. So it seems that after years of unearthed appeals from small local communities at risk of disappear, rather than being a problem, small towns are now becoming important resources. It is curious that some very famous architects who until yesterday designed skyscrapers in the center of Milan are now telling us what a resource life is in remote historical hamlets. I think there's a certain amount of demagogy in such a vision, which has now been adopted by politicians and local administrations. Actually, the economic and anthropological reasons why people live small towns still persist, despite the slogans and proclamations.
Thank you very much for that contribution. It's clear that the last few months have seen a lot of change for people and maybe a lot of new thinking as well. Noel, you've been in Clonmel. What's your experience been recently, both of the town maybe and of some of the last few months?
Yeah, I suppose I have an interesting experience in the sense I'm originally from the countryside, a farming background, but I've been living in Clonmel for the last 35 years, and I've seen it grow and evolve. But as a kid growing up, we were always told Clonmel was the largest inland town in Ireland. And one of the things everybody remarked during the lockdown was the silence, the absence of noise from cars. It was interesting there when Annuntiata was talking about the dense populations and living and trying to escape from those. I suppose Clonmel has been fortunate. We don't have high-rise apartments or any of that type of building, so people had their own space. One of the remarks I heard people constantly make was, as they looked at images on the TV of towns and apartments in lockdown, thanking God that they had green space, they had places they could walk, they had gardens they could get into, and so on. So I live in a little village just outside the town, Marlfield Village, and it's an area used by people from Clonmel as a recreational walking area. And the huge difference I noticed during the lockdown was families walking together, intergenerational. Generally, it would be used maybe by older people, middle-aged people as a relaxing walk around the lake and so on. But now people were walking out from the town as families and connecting. And remarkably, even though as the lockdown began to ease and shops still shut, people often came and just parked their cars in the town. And we have a beautiful blue way here in Clonmel, went for walks along there and walked from the town outwards. I suppose most people in the town of Clonmel do not live in the town. They live in estates on the periphery of the town. So that's probably a contrast to European cities and towns where you have dense populations in the centre. But listening to people here, they liked that. They liked the fact people had time and they had space and the quietness of it, along, of course, with the challenges of COVID. But I think it was a positive experience, and it also raised the question in the town for people of the lack of social spaces. And some of those social spaces that were obvious during the lockdown was very often little coffee shops were open where you could get takeaway coffee. And people came there to connect because the lockdown had a sense of isolation. So opportunities for connecting were grabbed quickly, especially maybe by people who had been used to going to coffee shops, didn't mind standing in queues and waiting. But I think Clonmel as a town lacks social spaces for people to connect. It's very much geared to traffic. And the contrast was now that the lockdown is lifted, suddenly there are queues of traffic into the town again, and people talk about the frustration and the difficulty of getting around. So maybe we did learn the lessons of COVID, or maybe we're going back to our old ways very fast, and the car is now dominating again.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Noel. So our second theme today is to talk about emerging directions of policy. So what we mean by that is policy is the decisions about how we use the resources we have, and that can be the people, the money, the time. It can be our buildings, our energy and natural environment. And policy is decisions about what those priorities are, and maybe how these are changing, how they need to change, and very importantly, when these decisions are being made, who is making them and how do people get involved in that process? Because everybody has something to bring to this, and it's very important that we have a wide engagement and collaboration about these decisions because they do affect everybody. So I might ask Annuntiata maybe to respond to that and to talk about her experience.
Yes, thank you. At the moment in Italy, architects and urban planners are studying a sort of geography of the pandemic, and that it is clear that the virus mainly struck the most productive fabric of our country, hence the big towns or the satellitized towns around important productive areas, for example, the Pianura Padana, where the pandemic was particularly violent. So a first reflection is on the relationship between the pandemic and the environment, and also on a possible relationship between climate changes and the diffusion of the coronavirus. The other aspect very important for us is now the new possible role of big and small towns. Not all architects, urban planners, and sociologists or economists agree on a possible revenge of the inner areas against the failure of the big towns model. The emergency, even if dramatic, has been too short to change rooted politics and behaviors, and it is a fact that the small towns in inner areas still present the same problem which have caused the continuous and persistent migration towards big towns since the last century. Actually, those who decide to spend the lockdown period in their native small town or village will rarely find the conditions to remain in. And furthermore, if you look at the fragility of the big towns, which the pandemic revealed, they are still latent. And in such a framework, architects and urban planners suggest, above all, a significant program of maintenance of the country, which is based both in big and small towns on the improvement of quality of life of citizens, rather than enhancing the contrast of big, small towns or city countryside, the possibility of comparing and exchanging the most successful place-based initiatives experimented both in Milan and then in the remote villages of the Alps, for example, seems to prevail in our field. Digital infrastructure of the territory, telehealth, working from home, but also the ecological reconversion of local economies by reorienting and improving local production chains and also improving activities from remote and digital platforms. That are some of the suggestions that come from people involved in politics. Interesting studies have also been focusing on the resilience shown by local communities, whether big or small, from big towns or hamlets. In many cases, they reorganize themselves, focusing on the topic of care, health, and solidarity. And they will discover that also in big towns, the usefulness of small shops in the neighborhood, for example, the importance of open public space is commonly neglected or forgotten. And they sometimes reveal creativity and talent in transforming segregation into opportunity. Many of these experiences are spontaneous and considered out of no programming strategy, but they seem to work better than national policies. In conclusion, I think the idea of gathering and sharing such examples of good practices to improve the quality of life in the community, trying to transform them into something more similar to urban policies, is one of the most challenging perspectives for researchers in urban studies in the post-COVID era. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I might go straight over to Miriam then. Miriam, would you like to speak about your own experience?
Thanks. It's fantastic to be part of this conversation on towns at a point where you say it's a really time of division in terms of where we'll go next because of our recent experience close up with streetscapes and the value of our local 2K. So after 10 years probably of studying 10 different towns in the southeast with WIT, with Sharon, we've come to Clonmel and brought some of that comparative analysis. I also should say I come from Mayo, a place which has experienced incredible depopulation from the town centres. So although Clonmel, by comparison with other towns we've studied, is faring relatively well, and there are quite a number of people living in the town centre, it still follows a pattern where the town has turned inside out. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that the town has suburbanized. People are living on the edge, and the town centre, the historic core, which is incredibly rich in Clonmel, has become vacated by people who live there. And I have a lovely quote from somebody I've been studying, an urbanist, William White, and he said that it's the people who like living in towns that make them attractive to people who don't. However, we don't quite know or have a figure on how many people are living right in the centre. By my estimate, we looked at NACE recently, I think something like 2 to 3% live in the historic town centre. Clonmel, it looks like 10%, and that actually is on the high end of people living in towns in Ireland. So we need to begin to gather more data to understand this. what has happened when people have vacated and moved towards the suburbs is the town centres have been taken over with shopping as the retail centre, and the chambers of commerce, etc., are speaking on behalf of the towns. But that now is under threat with COVID and with online shopping. So we need to rethink quite urgently what happens next to town centres. And my view is that town centres are now probably our most vulnerable heritage asset. We don't quite know how many people are living there. We don't have a constituent who speak for towns in terms of places to live and inhabit. So I've been working with the Heritage Council with Ali Harvey there, and she's been looking at about 12 different towns under a town centre health check. And she has found that the vacancy of shopping is growing. And in Europe, something around 10% vacancy of shopping is an alarm bell. In towns in Ireland, including towns in County Tipperary, it's in the order of 20 to 30%, and it's growing now. So we really need to address this issue of vacancy in town centres. And I probably maybe will end there, but just say I've been reading No One Shouts Stop by John Healy, and he wrote about this 2 generations ago in 1967 about his hometown, Charlestown town in County Mayo. I'm from Claremorris, County Mayo. I was there in the last few days, and it is really becoming derelict, because when people aren't living there, taking care day to day, not only of the buildings, but of the streetscapes, it's becoming more bleak. And that's all to do with our change of demographics, our population, and our choices. So I think now is a great time to address the backfilling of towns as an ideal place to live. Thanks, Orla.
Yeah, I'd like to call on Orla Murphy now to follow up with that. Orla, you've been involved in some initiatives and maybe moving from where we are with levels of vacancy and dereliction into what the opportunities are maybe and where the future direction might be.
Yes, thanks, Orla. And I suppose to pick up on Miriam's point about vacancy being really a problem that we've got to urgently address. The Heritage Council has been doing really good work through the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme to try to gather data on vacancy. Retail vacancy is not so complex to measure, but residential vacancy is quite difficult because it's the floors above the shops on streets in towns that are harder to measure. But we really do need data so that we can start to address issues of long-term vacancy in towns, because if towns aren't lived in, they start to wither. And currently, many of our towns, some have up to 80% vacancy at upper levels, which really means that they're in the critical care ward of towns. So we've got to act urgently. And there's also an opportunity through acting on vacancy to fold in climate change, to adapt buildings in a way that can retrofit them, can offer towns as low carbon urban centres. So just to mention one initiative that has taken place recently was a pilot project run by the Department of Rural and Community Development, which looked at 6 towns in Ireland. So it looked at Banagher, Ballinrobe, Boyle, Cappoquin, Callan and Castleblaney. And the local authorities had teams in those towns who worked specifically, they were given a small budget and worked specifically to think about ways of tackling, measuring and responding to long-term vacancy in towns. And a report has just been completed on that by myself and 2 of my colleagues, Philip Crowe and Madeleine Lees, as part of Space Engagers. And we kind of scanned the data gathered by that project and proposed 15 key actions. And that report is being published by the Department of Rural and Community Development just a couple of weeks ago. So those actions are under 5 key headings. So there's providing supports, because towns need supports to be able to address this issue of vacancy coherently. The second theme is finance and resources, because it became evident that there is a cost to adapting buildings and towns for reuse. Now that might be shorter term, greater cost, but what is the longer term and qualitative cost to not acting on that. And that's something that we have to take very seriously. And then there's a question of imagination and vision. So having a vision for what towns can be like as really great places to live is very important, so that we can see how great they can be to live in again and what that might be like. And also having confidence and motivation to act. So giving local authorities the power to take control of public realm, to initiate public realm strategies, to improve public spaces, to take on the buildings in their ownership and really adapt them and retrofit them to the best standards that they can be. And finally, the final theme is approach. So bringing along the people who live in the towns in terms of participatory planning, and having a town centre first policy. So that you say we don't allow primary healthcare buildings or schools to be built on the outskirts. We prioritise always the centre of the towns for any new building or for any infill or adaptive use building. And that's really, really important. So that town centre first policy is part of the programme for government, which is just fantastic. And we've been lobbying for that for quite a while. So how that's going to be implemented is really on the boards at the moment, and it's being discussed across departments. And one very important initiative might be to have an Ireland's Town partnership, a model of which has been introduced in Scotland some years ago. Scotland are ahead of us by about 10 years in this, in introducing policy around towns. And so it would be really, really interesting if we could follow their lead and adapt how they've been working with their towns urgently to address particularly this issue of vacancy and get people living back in towns.
Thanks, Orla. I think that leads really well into our third and our final theme, which is the contributions of the academy. So what we mean by that is, what can people involved in research and teaching bring to this? What can they do to support communities, maybe to help them shape ideas and to harness that local energy and initiative to get things done, and how that connects back into policy making and decision making at a national level, so that when the larger decisions are being made elsewhere, they support those local initiatives and they feed into what people are trying to achieve in their own communities. So I might call on Sharon here. Sharon is in WIT and has been involved in the local projects. Would you like to explain to us what you've been doing?
Yes, Orla, thanks very much. Lovely to be here today. As Loughlin said earlier, we came to Clonmel with 22 students, fourth year Bachelor of Architecture students from Waterford Institute of Technology, and we studied Clonmel. We looked at the urban morphology and we mapped what I would call an exodus of people from the town, really from going back to the early Middle Ages. And we produced maps that showed how people had gradually moved from living in the town centre and had moved out into the suburbs. So that was really, really useful. And we could bring the energy of the students, 22 of them, into the town to go and look at the town and to talk to local people. And as Loughlin also said, we met the transition year students from the presentation school. And it was wonderful for our students to hear young people talk about what they felt worked with the town and then what didn't work, and to hear them tell us the type of spaces that they wanted in the town. And this is a really useful learning experience for our students. It's real world project design and engagement with towns. One of the things, as no one mentioned, was that there was a lack of social space in Clonmel, and our students quickly tuned into the fact that Clonmel, of course, is a street town. It's dominated by streets. There isn't really any central public space, particularly for young people to congregate and to enjoy the town, to look at what's happening. And that's what they want. They want to be in the center of things. So we have a number of students, a number of projects from the students that are available for people to see in the Junction Festival. And one of them was very interesting in that it proposed a public space that would connect O'Connell Street with the quays and with the river. And this was, again, the students reacting to the town turning its back onto the river and not having a central public space. So this project is really interesting, and there are a number of them like this, which I'd encourage people to take a look at as part of the Junction Festival. So bringing students and lecturers who have expertise in research and students who have incredible ideas and lots of design energy to towns is very, very important. And we have an urban laboratory in WIT, which every year looks at a town in the southeast, studies the form of the town, looks at patterns that have developed over time, people leaving the towns, how people use the towns. And this builds up a reservoir of information that the towns can tap into. One of the challenges that we had with our students was that it was very difficult to find information on the types of spaces that were in, for example, O'Connell Street and Clonmel. So we came across this in a collaborative project that we did also with Waterford City and County Council and with the Cultural Quarter for O'Connell Street in Waterford. And we spent a week organising with the students and with these local authorities and with also the Cultural Quarter to investigate how we could map all of the internal spaces of the street. And this is what you need. It's a space audit. You need to find out what's there and then where is the potential within those buildings to create a unified vision, for example, one whole street or one whole block. So the local authority helped us out in this, and they gave us access to all the planning files for O'Connell Street and Waterford. And that meant then that we could digitize all of the plans that were available for each individual building, the ground floors, the first floors, the second floors, and the third floors. And that meant then that we created one entire map of the street, a little bit like Giambattista Annoli's map of Rome from the 18th century, where you could see the inside plans of the buildings and the public space. And this was, we were in the process of creating this map and of documenting that process where the students, along with lecturers and the local authority and a community group, the Cultural Quarter, came together to produce a visualization of all the spaces that are in the street, and then to bring design thinking as to how you could create spaces for, in this case, it was the creative industries to come and occupy those spaces, both to live and to work and to create enterprises on the street. But you can't really do that unless you know what spaces are there. So when you peel back the facades, wonderful spaces were revealed to us, big open plan spaces, lots of really interesting roof spaces with lots of light, interesting patterns for how people would have actually physically used those spaces, both to live above the shop and in the shop itself. So where staircases were, where front doors were. This is the kind of information that you really need to know about how to re-inhabit these, or particularly the upper floors. So it was a really good example of how you can take all the energy and the time or some time that departments of architecture have, and then put it to really good use in the service of the towns. So that's
Thanks very much. Thank you, Sharon. And that actually ties in with some of my own work, which is to overcome some of these regulatory obstacles to using towns. So it's often things that can be made, decisions made quite remotely about something else that can be a real barrier, and small initiatives can overcome some of those barriers. And all these small things can actually add up to quite a lot. So I think we're going to Miriam next. Miriam, you've been involved in the Clonmel project as well.
Yes, and also with Sharon on the Waterford project. So mapping towns and understanding space definitely is one part of the jigsaw that we need to understand towns and what we can do. And I guess what students of architecture can bring is the reimagination as to what's possible. We also have a privilege which local authorities don't have, and that's that we can choose which town to work on. Local authorities are often find it hard in a democracy to prioritise which town to help. And they all have in the order of 10 to 15 towns all needing help. But I think in Ireland, in terms of what can researchers do, is to somehow point towards exemplars. And I think we need more exemplars in Ireland. So Irish people are very adaptive. We've all bought into about the house. We all now want fantastic houses to live in. I think it's about time now we have about the town and begin to reimagine how we live again in town centres. And for that needs high capital investment in a few key places, not the spreading of money equally among all of the towns. So if I'm to make a plea for where research needs to go, It's to identify when money goes to one town as opposed to another, what are the indicators, who's measuring it, and in a way what Orla has done with CFIT is to measure the differences and which places get more for their money. So this value for money is really important. My own research is in the social life of public spaces. So it isn't just the buildings, it's what the life of the street is. 10% of a building's cost is at ground floor level, and yet it's 90% of what we experience about a street or a town. And we really need to begin to think more about the streetscape, particularly if we bring living back into towns. We need to deal with the threshold to deal with privacy. So there's a whole design issue that comes with retrofitting towns. There's also the demographics of dealing with older people, slowing down the pace, which we felt through COVID, that our towns were quieter and the car was calmed. We have no figures on, for every car parking space in an Irish town, how much money does that car parking space bring to business, and how much would it bring to other measures of sociability without that car parking space? So there are lots of gaps in our knowledge about towns. And so this is a time to say, use the resources of the academy, pay us to do this research, and we can produce the comparative analysis so that decisions can be informed. So I think those are a few of the spectrum, but mainly if we're to turn towns into these great places to live in again, we need the help, and we need to not just let it happen by accident, but to direct it, and then to research and to invest time and energy in that. So it's great to have this conversation. This is the beginnings of these new decisions for this new government. So it's good timing.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Noel, would you like to comment on what Miriam's been speaking about?
Yeah, I found everybody's contribution fascinating, especially Miriam's there. But I'll give you an example. When we linked up with the WIT students down in Clonmel Museum, it was fascinating to hear the interactions, because it was an intergenerational gathering. And 10% of my transition year students were Spanish. And as the WIT students outlined the use of space in the town and so on, and I asked the question of the students, how many of you would like, if you went home this evening, your parents said they're moving into town, how many of you would like to move in? None of the Irish students would like to move in. They prefer living in the suburbs. Whereas the Spanish students were aghast. They couldn't imagine not living in the centre of town. That's where their social space is. That's where they connect. So I found that insight very interesting, even though young people will always want to go to town, but they didn't see it as a place to live. Whereas in contrast, there was some other people there who are retired or about to retire, whose families have grown up and said they would love to live in town. But there is no opportunity in the way we use spaces here in Clonmel for people to move back into town. They would love to be able to ditch the car, have public transport, be able to walk, to have the cup of coffee, have the meal, have the drink. But that is not facilitated in the way the planning is done. I was fascinated by Miriam's contribution there about targeted capital investment to set up role models. And if you want an example of it, when Ireland joined the EU, farmers had to modernise, and that's exactly how the Department of Agriculture did it. They set up or targeted particular innovative farmers and then used them as models, and other farmers latched on. I think we have a model of that quite near here at the town of Dungarvan. Produced the Greenway. If you notice in its planning, you can walk to everything in Dungarvan. You need not get into a car. In fact, it facilitates people. And it has brought people into the town and centre. And the word reimagining and creating a new vision has been used by contributors throughout this. And I think this crisis is an opportunity to reimagine and vision. The history teacher in me would say, historically, towns were marketplaces. There were people who came together to buy their produce, sell their produce. Now that can be done online, a lot of it. Towns, what's the prime need people have now? It's for social connection. And towns have an opportunity to build social connection. Two of my adult children are now working from home at the moment because of COVID. We have a streetscape in Clonmel lying idle, surely internet hubs could be set up where people could now live in their rural towns, go in, connect socially, high-speed broadband, and so on. There's a chance here for towns to reimagine themselves. I was fascinated by the Waterford student of architecture who pointed out, I mean, people say that to me who come to visit here, say, what a beautiful town to drive into. And yet, from a planning point of view, we've turned our back on the most beautiful spaces. We put up a wall along our river, you can't see it. The quays, for instance, as you drive up along, there's no houses facing south. Beautiful south-facing views, sunshine, everything. And I think, you know, there's an absence of green spaces. It was fascinating, the WIT students, when they went back into historical maps, St. Mary's car park up Mary Street there. That was a whole green space for the town. And what I found fascinating by the students, when they did the research, they had no awareness of anything above shop floor level. And when I got them to look up, they were shocked actually at the number of blank spaces, nobody living there. The lanes in Clonmel, which would historically have linked with the river because that was the main highway, they had no awareness of their existence. And I think that's from the absence of living there. And as somebody who has lived here for the last 35 years, I have seen that emptying of the town centre. And if you were living in the town centre right now and you wanted to get a newspaper or anything, you have to walk to the edge. They're no longer available. They were available in 1985. So COVID-19 is a crisis. It's a chance to reimagine. And I think Clonmel could reimagine itself as a social hub that connects people, as a town that offers a quality of life and access to the mountains and rivers, and to be able to work from there and not have to live in major urban centres. So I think education has a role in raising awareness, and I was very interested in Miriam's contribution. If people are not living at the heart of a town, they don't have a stake in that town. The only people that have a stake in that town are the business community, and some of the big multinational businesses we know are transient. They move and shift. We need people who have a long-term stake, an intergenerational stake in the town. And how do we reimagine and bring people back in? There's a housing crisis, and yet there's lots of houses available in Clonmel, right in the centre of town.
Thank you very much, Noel. Thank you. I think that ties in as well with a lot of the direction that Orla Murphy would be working in. And would you like to just maybe comment on that, Orla?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with everything that Noel was saying there about, firstly, the latent potential that is in our towns as really great places to live, and increasingly so in terms of climate change and in terms of a post-COVID landscape. So towns offer opportunities to work from home, to be part of a social network that uses the street, that uses public spaces as really kind of the gel between in an urban tightly knit community. But that's not working at the moment. So we really have to understand, we can't just will it to work. We have to understand what are the barriers that are stopping people from living in towns. And that is why research is so important. That's why we've actually got to find the data and to research across disciplines. Why are people not, why have they deserted towns? Why are they reluctant to take on living back in towns? Is it that the fabric is just not suitable for contemporary living? Is it that it's just too expensive? Is it that there are planning difficulties? Is it that there are building control, regulatory difficulties? It's very hard sometimes to work with protected structures when you also have to balance fire safety and disability access certificates and planning. So we need to both research those reasons, but also then from that research, find out how we can effect change through removing those barriers, working with people who are interested in taking on buildings to live back in towns to help them to do that. And the local authorities are very important in that process. So we've all got to work together. We founded CFIT, the UCD Centre for Irish Towns in UCD, as fundamentally a transdisciplinary and also interinstitutional group to network and gather, because there's been so much research going on around towns, but it has been quite disconnected. So our aim is to connect all that research, to gather the data, to say what are the knowledge gaps, and to increasingly get researchers to look at that across disciplines and to use that to inform policy and make things happen on the ground. Because this is really, really urgent. We've got to act now. We can't leave it for another 5 years.
Thank you very much, Orla. So that's the end of our third theme. I'd just like to briefly maybe ask Professor Loughlin Kealy to comment just for a minute or two on his thoughts on that session, and then we'll close.
That's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you to everybody. I keep being struck by how similar this kind of discussion is to conversations about what to do about climate change, you know, that all the time one's talking about, I suppose, the long-term and the short-term connections and the interchange between them, you know, how somehow you can do things now that have effects going in the longer term. The whole question of actually understanding how to connect knowledge with action, you know, the amount of research that we do, how do we translate that into actions that are actually sustain and pursue the things that we want into the future? So at one level, the conversation that we've been having deals with a particular town, I suppose. Clonmel has been somewhere in the center of the discussion. But actually, we're talking about an issue that's much wider than one particular place. And I think what our conversation this morning has shown is the importance of learning from experience. You know, that there's a lot of information out there that we can bring and we can harvest it. And also that we need to learn from what we can study, that we need to collect information that will inform our decisions into the future. The important thing, I think, also is that we learn how to use information, that we actually have ways where we can learn from what other people know and how to create conversations that are forward-looking. The question is always, to me, the short term, not to allow the short term to preclude the possibilities for the longer term. Put it very simply, if we continue to concentrate our building on the periphery of towns, we actually cut off the possibility of developing them from the inside out. You know, we're actually preclude possibilities by short-term decisions, and we need to keep those things very firmly in mind. Just to say that, like climate change, like climate change, you can't wait, I think, for the perfect moment. You know, that you have to take decisions in the short term that will have long-term implications, but do those in an informed way. And I think that's why we're talking about using an ecological model for a project, because it's an ecology that's inclusive of the human mind, of human emotions, of human desires, of our desire for culture and connectivity. And also something that Noel touched on in his conversation, there are issues of environmental justice here and intergenerational justice, and actually allowing people of different generations to enjoy and to experience life in the full. And towns, I think, have a really critical part to play in that. Question of looking after each other and looking after the planet. Those things are intimately connected. So I'd just like to thank everybody for their contribution here. It's been really interesting to listen to it. And let's hope it's useful to generate further conversations.
Thank you very much, Loughlin. Just to conclude, I'd like to invite people to send in their questions. We'll have a Q&A session, and you can either send them in through the Facebook page for Clonmel Junction Arts Festival or through Twitter for Clonmel Junction Arts Festival. So finally, just to thank our panel, Noel Buckley, Miriam Fitzpatrick, Loughlin Kealy, Orla Murphy, Sharon O'Brien, Annuntiata Maria Oteri, And of course to thank the Arts Festival Director, Cliona Marr, and Colin Everett, who's been responsible for production. So we look forward to the Q&A session now, and we'd invite people to take part.
Hello, I'm Sharon O'Brien. I'm a lecturer in architecture in the Department of Architecture at Waterford Institute of Technology. I'm here today to show you the areas of Clonmel that I, my colleagues and my students worked on as part of our design project to explore how people could live back in the town centre of Clonmel. And I will be showing you the 4 areas of Clonmel that we focused on for our project. We worked in partnership on this project, Eyes in the Town, with South Tipperary Arts Centre, Tipperary County Museum and Presentation Secondary School.
Hi, my name is Zach Daly. I'm a 22-year-old architecture student from WIT in Waterford City. In semester 8 of this year, we were asked to design a mixed-use urban development plan in the heart of Clonmel. At the start of the semester, we were given 3 sites, site A, B and C, and I chose site A due to the fact that it was a large open car park that joined onto the main street of Clonmel, which is O'Connell Street, and also another main street called Mary Street to the west. Within my site, I wanted to create 2 open spaces, one square that linked Mary Street to Gladstone Street, and another square that linked O'Connell Street to the main square via Hopkins Lane. I hope you like my design. So the name of my project was called Coachman Square, which I'll briefly explain later on. And the title of this project was called Proposing an Architecture for Sustainable Living in a Regional Urban Centre. My site location for my scheme was the car park in the heart of Clonmel, joining onto O'Connell Street and Mary Street. My inspiration for my scheme came from the historical maps from 1888 up until now, where I looked at the development of the site over the years. I liked the idea of the townhouses along Hopkins Lane that were there originally and wanted to incorporate them back into my scheme. Along this lane would have been O'Gorman's coach factory, which gives the name to the project. My aim was to join Gladstone Street, Mary Street and O'Connell Street with a public realm space that served as a market area and also an area for residents looking onto the square. The square itself allowed for small commercial activity with the ability of market stalls to be placed in between islands, while allowing the flow of the area to remain the same. When no markets were in use, the islands act as seating area for passers-by. There are 4 housing types on my scheme, with each having its own roof terrace to look over the Clonmel Mountains and also in some cases the square below. The front room acts as an office space or an additional living space which would hope to bring more home businesses to the area, reducing the need to travel to work by car and therefore being more sustainable. The square is laid out in a T-shape which joins the new widened Hopkins Lane with a new lane that merged into the main square which is in between Mary Street and Gladstone Street. With the aim of having light commercial activity in the area, I'd like to imagine busy pedestrian square flowing onto these busy streets of Clonmel. So this is my project called Coachman Square, and I hope you liked it. Thanks for listening.
Hello, my name is Miriam Fitzpatrick and I'm a 4th year architecture student from WIT. Today I will be presenting to you my final studio project from 4th year, which was a housing scheme within the town of Clonmel. My housing scheme was made up of 32 apartments which could house up to 126 people. The main idea of my housing scheme was to create a sustainable way of living within the town of Clonmel, which could provide an area for living and an area for life within the town. My site is located along the quay of the river shore and connects to Clonmel's O'Connell Street through 3 laneways. The positioning of my buildings is in reflection to the historical built environment of the quays. The quays were once a very lively place, a vital connection, bringing goods in and out of Clonmel. Currently, the quays serve as a functional space for Clonmel, mainly a through space for traffic. Through my project, I aim to rejuvenate the quays by regaining the density that was once present along the riverfront and creating a destination whilst keeping the connections to O'Connell Street. My scheme aims to connect Quay Street, both physically and visually, to the Shore River and Clonmel Mountains, whilst creating a sustainable way of living throughout the town. I aim to remove a minimal amount of infrastructure whilst having a maximum effect on Clonmel as a town. My scheme is made up of 3 buildings, all mixed use following the same overall function. Each building is made up of commercial units roofed by apartments with green roofs. The building along the quay is a triple height market space which will provide a destination and opportunity for the sale of local produce. The tower building is anchored by a double height cafe looking out to the Clonmel Mountains and the public square. The L-shaped building hosts a more urban commercial units, creating a more commercial diversity within the scheme.
The scheme keeps a central stair core between an optimum amount of residential units, so it becomes easier for residents to get to know each other. I aim to create a sustainable sense of living within the residential and functionality of the scheme. The mixed-use development, where the ground floor serves the above floors and the above floors sustain the life below. The old town walls feature arches along with the main guard. This sparked the use of structural arches and to also honestly express the structure of the market space. To create a feeling of being under a structure while still having a sense of being outside. The ground floor of the public realm also flows into the market space to maintain this feeling and express the continuity and rhythm of the space. For my public realm, I created a contemporary amphitheatre-like space to frame a view of the Clonmel Mountains, which is placed between my two buildings on the quay. The pool on the quay side of the public realm reminds the user of the river beside you, blocked by the view of the existing wall and flood defences. This pool also reflects the mountains onto the public space.
My name is Thomas Connolly and I'm a fourth-year architecture student in Waterford Institute of Technology. Following is my submission for my Semester 2 studio project. I've designed an apartment complex in the town of Clonmel called the Pine Apartments, and this apartment complex will comprise of 26 apartments that will bring a further 96 residents into the town of Clonmel. First of all, I'd like to start by giving a bit of context to my project and describe the site. The site is placed between O'Connell Street and Quay Street, and there's a slight slope of 3 metres between the two. There are 3 narrow laneways that flow through the site, which have been used previously as access routes for the unloading of goods off the river shore. My initial design was inspired by the negative space within the existing block and what habitual space could be liberated in the immediate future. As time would advance, this form would morph through the urban block and slowly regain life back into the town. The development is mapped out in 3 phases: creating space from the empty space, reshaping the existing form, and complete retrofit. The site features a mix of stone structures of historical importance and new warehouses serving the shops on O'Connell Street. By removing all the new steel warehouses, what remains is the bones of a courtyard, which will be used in the last phase of the design. When designing my public realm, I followed a selection of design principles that would elevate the public space, such as natural surveillance from the above apartments, seating, greenery, and glazing ground floor facades to allow for interior activities to flow out onto the street. In fear of further diluting the commercial density, there are no new commercial spaces within the scheme. Instead, the existing units are given a new facade to facilitate the new public square. At the south end of the public square, a bridge is placed to allow a new pedestrian access to Shore Island, an area which has planned future development. The townhouses on the north elevation and the stone warehouse are used as nodes which flow through my new structure. On the ground floor, the stone warehouse will be used as the entrance to the above apartments and will also serve as a space for vital facilities like bins, letterboxes, bikes, and overflow storage. A band of apartments loop around light wells and circulation cores as it is raised above the square. Through these light wells, pine trees protrude upwards through it. These trees, paired with staggered window openings and reflective glass, all work together to ensure maximum privacy. As you travel up through the 3 stair cores, you are led to the first floor of apartments. The south side of the block features 3-bedroom family apartments. On the north side, facing O'Connell Street, 1-bedroom apartments for the elderly are placed, and in the centre, 2-bedroom apartments are placed, ideally for young families. There is 1 more level of apartments, which is surmounted by a roof garden. Considering the block is elevated, I created a strong element overhead. To take advantage of this space, I hung swings from the soffit of the building. I believe this elevates the area by giving it a sense of play and a strong character. Within each apartment, there are several attempts to make the space feel larger. As you enter the apartment, you are met with an entrance space, which acts as a buffer zone before you walk into the main living area. This buffer zone gives the user a space to remove shoes and outerwear. Each apartment also clearly separates the living from the sleeping. This division will also act in creating a larger feeling apartment. Each apartment is also equipped with a balcony. A louver system is used on the facade of the building, which pivots and slides back and forth at the control of the resident. This is an attempt to add a dynamic element to the public realm and also to allow for complete control of lighting and privacy within. As you look at the building's elevation, you can see how the building shows a difference in permeability throughout the day as different conditions are desired.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Mulhall. I'm a fourth year architecture student in WIT. I am privileged to be a part of Clonmel's Junction Art Festival this year. My project is titled New Market Square, Clonmel. The main drive behind this project, I suppose, was to create a new public market square within Clonmel's town centre. I hope that this would bring a sense of community, energy and life back into what was once a very densely populated urban block. The idea, I suppose, stemmed from a historical analysis of the site where I found out that the existing laneways such as East Lane was once used to slaughter animals and then sell the meat at the local meat markets within the urban block. I thought this was the perfect opportunity to revisit that idea of a market within the urban block. So my proposal would accommodate 148 more people into Clonmel's town centre. I think this complements our theme of our semester this year, of Urban Earth, which I think would create a more resilient and sustainable town centre for Clonmel. So in the urban realm plan at 1:500, you can see the location of the urban block. So to the north is Market Street, east Emmett Street, south Mitchell Street, and to the west is Gladstone Street. So it's a very central urban block. Some of the existing warehouses and back of house plots were removed for this proposed development. So the urban strategies that I wished to tackle was to redefine the street edge along Market Street. It is very poorly defined at the moment. It's a lot of open space, a lot of void. So I wanted to rebuild that, first of all. And then I also wanted to use the dimensions of existing public squares. So I chose Meeting House Square in Dublin, which is approximately 20 metres by 26 metres. This gives a proper sense of scale for a successful public square. So I also wanted to use the existing laneways as access points to the public square, and this is then mirrored on the opposite side of the site, which creates a sort of pinwheel circulation situation, which is very clearly defined. So staying on this plan here, you can see the ground level is shown, and it has two L-shaped blocks and one linear block. The northern L-shaped block at ground level will become commercial units facing onto Market Street, bringing a sense of life and energy to there as well. And then the southern L-shaped block will be used as indoor markets. Both of the L-shaped blocks have the residential apartments above, so there are circulation cores accessible from the public square, which will increase activity within the square at all times of the day. The linear block then will host the Great Market Hall, which will be double height market space, which would really attract people into the public square, I imagine. The ground floor, what I wanted most was for it to be as permeable as possible and accessible as possible, which would entice people into the square. So next we have the elevations of block 1. You can see I used the height of the existing buildings along Market Street to determine the height of the ground floor commercial and market units. The south elevation, you can see that on the ground floor level and the circulation cores, I cladded these with sandstone, which alludes to the town's historic sites such as the Main Guard and Westgate. The corresponding floor plans are shown alongside this. The floor plans shown would be stacked twice, which allows 2 double height apartments per floor, which I think would be ideal for larger families, as it provides a greater sense of space, a greater quality of living with natural light and ventilation. The next set of drawings, you can see the same situation is found for block 2. So in the sections here, section AA, you can see, I think best here, the space I hope to create between the built environment, which is just as important as in a project like this, as the public space is really where the life and energy of the project happens. So you can see that here, the scale, And you can also see the change of scale between existing buildings and along the edge of the urban block, and then also the new development. So the new development is 4 floors high, but also a roof garden. This is quite high, but I think, but I chose to do that to create, I suppose, greater density within the block. Section B, you can see clearly here a distinction between the floor to ceiling heights of each different element. So the ground level commercial and market units are much greater, and then you can see in height, and then you can see the single height apartments in comparison to the double height apartments. Next, then I have a precedent study. So this just shows a quick precedent of what I'd hope the inside of each apartment and the quality of each apartment would be. So nice and light and airy. This precedent is Moyaga Apartments by Realm Architects in South Korea. And then also next you have a material 3D study of 1 bay, and this shows the construction, and you can see the 1:50 details there as well. So that is a brief summary of my project New Market Square, Clonmel. I really enjoyed this project and the challenges that it presented. Some of the challenges include sustainability, public versus private, the scale of the project within the town, and then also the quality of living within the apartments. But I think the biggest challenge of all was attempting to attract all generations back into the town centre from the suburbs where most families and generations reside. But I believe that this is a challenge that we as young architects will continue to face if Irish towns are to be revived and to survive. So that's all. Thank you very much for listening.